Good morning. Welcome to the November 2020 open meeting of the Federal Communications Commission. Madam Secretary, could you please outline our agenda for the morning?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to you and good morning, commissioners.
Morning.
For today's meeting, you will hear 6 items for your consideration. First, you will consider a first report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order of proposed modification that would adopt rules to repurpose 45 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.850 to 5.895 gigahertz band for unlicensed operations. Retain 30 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.895 to 5.925 gigahertz band for the Intelligent Transportation System service, and require the transition of the ITS radio service standard from dedicated short range. Second, you will consider a report and order that would streamline the Commission's satellite licensing rules by, among other things, creating an optional framework for authorizing space stations and blanket licensed Earth stations through a unified license. Third, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would propose to add a new allocation in the 17.3 to 17.8 gigahertz band for fixed satellite service space to Earth downlinks and to adopt associated technical rules. Fourth, you will consider a notice of proposed rulemaking that would propose expansion of the telecommunications relay services, or TRS, fund contribution base for supporting video relay service, VRS, and Internet Protocol Relay Service, IP Relay, to include intrastate telecommunications revenue as a way of strengthening the funding base for these forms of TRS and making it more equitable without increasing the size of the fund itself. Fifth, you will consider a report and order that would modify the Commission's rules governing the resolution of program carriage disputes between video programming vendors and multi-channel video programming distributors. Sixth, you will consider an enforcement action. This is your agenda for today. The first item, entitled Modernizing the 5.9 gigahertz band, will be presented by the Office of Engineering and Technology, and Ron Rapazzi, Acting Chief of the Office, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And Mr. Rapazzi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. It is my pleasure to present for your consideration a first report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order of proposed modification that sets forth another of the Commission's innovative solutions to make additional mid-band spectrum available for unlicensed uses. This item makes 45 megahertz of mid-band spectrum immediately available in the 5850 to 5925 megahertz band, or the 5.9 gigahertz band, for indoor unlicensed operations, and proposes rules for outdoor unlicensed use. At the same time, the item designates the remaining 5.9 gigahertz spectrum for licensed, safety-related, intelligent transportation system operations, or ITS, to foster ITS operations that until now have seen limited deployment. This item is the product of a collaborative effort of staff across the entire Commission. In particular, we thank OGC, OEA, and the Wireless Bureau for their contributions and getting this item to you today. Jamie Coleman, Chief of OET's Spectrum Policy Branch, will present the item. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rapazzi. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The item before you is a first report and order, further notice of proposed rulemaking, and order of proposed modification that will promote the efficient and effective use of the 5.85 to 5.925 gigahertz or 5.9 gigahertz band. It opens a segment of the band for unlicensed operations and maintains the remainder of the band for important safety-related transportation and vehicular communications to ensure that the American public realizes the maximum value of this important but long underused mid-band spectrum. The demand for spectrum to support unlicensed applications such as Wi-Fi has intensified in recent years. The 5.9 GHz band is especially well positioned to deliver immediate and significant benefits for unlicensed devices that could be combined with existing unlicensed spectrum in adjacent frequencies to provide cutting-edge, high-throughput broadband applications on channels up to 160 megahertz wide. For 2 decades, the 5.9 GHz band has been designated for use by Dedicated Short-Range Communications, or DSRC. The expectation was that DSRC-based equipment operating in the band would be widely deployed in cars and along roadways to provide for the safety-related transportation and vehicular communications needs of the Intelligent Transportation System. But recently, a different technology, Cellular Vehicle to Everything, or CV2X, has gained momentum as a means of providing safety-related transportation and vehicular communications, and its proponents seek access to the 5.9 GHz band for those purposes. Today's decision is informed by these considerations. The first report and order adopts rules to repurpose the lower 45 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.85 to 5.895 GHz band from the ITS radio service to unlicensed devices. Unlicensed indoor operations will be allowed immediate access to the 5.85 to 5.895 GHz band. ITS licensees will be required to transition to the upper 30 megahertz of spectrum in the 5.895 to 5.925 GHz band and cease operations in the 5.85 to 5.895 GHz band no later than 1 year following the effective date of this first report and order. This first report and order also requires ITS radio service licensees to transition from the DSRC-based operations to CV2X technology. The further notice of proposed rulemaking addresses the details of that transition, including the appropriate timeline for implementation and the technical parameters needed for operation of CV2X in the 5.895 to 5.925 GHz band. The further notice also seeks to establish power and emission limits and other technical rules to allow full power outdoor unlicensed operations across the 5.85 to 5.895 GHz band once ITS operations have exited this portion of the band, subject to any further necessary protections for federal operations in the spectrum. In addition, the further notice seeks comment on whether the Commission should allocate additional spectrum for ITS applications in the future. The order of proposed modification begins the process of modifying all ITS licenses in the 5.9 GHz band pursuant to the conditions specified in the first report and order, subject to the procedures for license modifications set forth in Section 316 of the Communications Act. Staff recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges solely for technical and conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Coleman, for your presentation. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we put to end to 2 decades of waste and inefficient use of the valuable 5.9 gigahertz band. Going forward, this spectrum will not only advance the deployment of state-of-the-art automobile safety systems, but also those cutting-edge technologies that rely on unlicensed use. Many, many years ago, Commissioner Rosenworcel and I took the task to champion these frequencies as the best opportunity for unlicensed expansion due to their location next to the current 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi band. Additionally, I proposed the potential split of this 75 megahertz band into 30 megahertz automobile safety channel and a 45 megahertz unlicensed block, in line with an industry group's similar proposal. Many manufacturers and car companies engaged in this debate fully agree that 30 megahertz meets their current needs and is in line with the global community's approach to 5.9 gigahertz automobile safety systems. Further, the Commission has proposed other spectrum to car companies to deploy safety systems, such as radars and LiDAR, that have been used to introduce some of the safety applications initially planned for DSRC. So I'm extremely pleased, bordering on ecstatic, that after so many years of talk, there is finally action. After all the obstacles and setbacks we have had to overcome, the vision which I outlined many years ago and for which I took so many arrows and accepted many concessions is now becoming reality. For what is most promising about this new unlicensed allocation is the ability of Wi-Fi providers to rapidly incorporate it into existing offerings as soon as the order is effective. Most equipment will be able to take advantage of this spectrum with only quick software upgrades. The importance of our in-home networks, which rely on the availability of sufficient unlicensed spectrum to meet demand, has been highlighted during this pandemic. We depend on our Wi-Fi systems to do our jobs and schoolwork, communicate with friends and families, video conference with our doctors, and entertain ourselves while being isolated at home. In fact, we can thank Wi-Fi for allowing many of us, including myself, to participate in this and observe the Commission's meeting. While I'm pleased with the overall direction of today's item, there are some things that we should have done differently. In particular, the transition time to relocate the few DSRC incumbents out of the new unlicensed portion of the band should have been 6 months instead of 1 year. While I understand that there are some roadside infrastructure and vehicle equipped with DSRC, most existing equipment is being used for testing purposes and experimental use. After 20 years, just over 15,000 cars were ever equipped with DSRC, and only 3,000 of those cars were commercially sold, and none are currently for sale. That's 3,000 cars out of the almost 275 million registered vehicles on the road in the U.S. today, with none on the lot waiting to be sold. Amazing. The roadside infrastructure, therefore, is not being used to keep Americans safe, but rather for government-funded demonstrations and trials of systems that will never come to be. That is essentially a road to nowhere. Waiting a full year for this spectrum to be fully available is much, much too long. This spectrum is needed now to expand unlicensed capabilities and capacity and to provide the larger channel sizes needed to increase speed and lower latency. We shouldn't pretend to be unlicensed champions while unnecessarily delaying the full use of this band. Instead, we should be moving to maximize outdoor unlicensed use, even if such use is approved under our special temporary authority process pending resolution of the remaining issues identified in the further notice. Further, the order should have clearly stated that the 30 megahertz reserved for the automobile industry can only be used for safety purposes. Everyone admits that's the intent, and the auto industry even pledges that that is the case. Then why exactly can't this be certain in our rules? Is it because we all secretly acknowledge that some industry proponents want to misuse the safety band? Under no circumstances should the Commission be given spectrum handouts to an industry to provide services that are commercially available using other frequencies. Unfortunately, even though I proposed edits to address this problem, they did not carry the day and were not approved. However, I do appreciate that reserving the spectrum for safety purposes only was added to the further notice. Lastly, I'm extremely disappointed that the Commission did not take a technology-neutral approach in this item. It would have been far more beneficial if the Commission had simply provided the spectrum for vehicle safety systems and allowed car manufacturers and the various proponents to determine the best technology path. Alas, there seems to be consensus that the automobile industry will not be able to come to such an agreement, leaving the Commission, which is not an automobile safety expert, in the untenable position of picking winners and losers in this tug of war. In this vein, history is repeating itself. Once again, we are codifying a technology in our rules. While CV2X is a very promising safety technology, we do not know what will be available in 2, 5, or 10 years from now. I fear we will end up like we did with DSRC, with our rules being based on a specific technology, precluding technological innovation and advancement. CV2X is certainly the right direction to go in the immediate future for automobile safety, but it doesn't need to be embedded in our rules for it to be successful. Regardless of these shortcomings, this item overall does a lot of good by permitting both unlicensed use and CV2X automobile safety applications and creating a framework to ensure that harmful interference will not occur. Further, I appreciate that many edits addressed were included. Now that CV2X is the car safety application of the near future, we have to allow industry to actually access the spectrum. The chairman's proposal posted 3 weeks ago did not provide any certainty as to when the spectrum will be available. I'm pleased that at my request to ensure that the spectrum will be accessible for CV2X with some limitations in the near term using a streamlined waiver process that was supported by my colleagues. this certainly, as opposed to forcing parties to wait for resolution of the further notice, will allow the automobile industry to make definitive plans, place equipment orders, and ultimately get the safety technology to cars. I'm also pleased that my suggestion was implemented to move the discussion of NTIA's proposed exclusion zones for outdoor unlicensed use to the further notice. Unlicensed users will need to protect the federal incumbents in the ban, but more consideration is needed with regard to exclusion zones versus coordination zones and their appropriate sizes. We should never allow and have considered this going down this path in the first place. In the end, I thank my colleagues for endorsing this important item and for considering my many requested edits. I especially want to thank Commissioner Rosenworcel for working with me over the years on introducing unlicensed use in this band. I appreciate the chairman for presenting us with a draft item on indoor use before I leave the commission. I look forward to following the ongoing proceeding as it relates to outdoor use and the completion of the transition to DSRC to CV2X as an observer, and I hope it will be concluded with all due haste. I also want to thank the hardworking professionals, especially the staff of the Office of Engineering and Technology, for their efforts in getting us this item. People ask me all the time, what's the experience of being a commissioner? I tell them with sound vision, strategic moves, and extraordinary perseverance, a commissioner can move mountains. This item will always be a testament to my point. I will approve the item, and I thank the chair for the discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thanks so much. If there's one thing my FCC colleagues and I all agree on, and admittedly there are days where it feels like it's difficult to come up with more than one, the one thing is the importance of mid-band spectrum. In our speeches and testimony, in our statements and tweets, we have all made it clear that freeing up additional mid-band spectrum is critical to securing America's leadership in wireless. Now, talking about mid-band spectrum is a far, far easier task than actually freeing up this scarce resource. And that's why I want to give credit to Chairman Pai, to his team, and really the bureaus and offices within the agencies for all of their efforts over the past few years. Now, if you look back at the trade press headlines or quotable quotes over the same period of time, I'll admit that they have not all been glowing, or at least sometimes they're glowing red hot and not favorable towards the FCC's proposals. These are tough fights. A lot of people view this as a zero-sum game. Incumbent stakeholders, whether federal or commercial, have pushed back on a lot of our mid-band efforts. All of that is evidence, I think, that this FCC hasn't just kicked the can down the road. We've not left it to future commissions to take on the tough spectrum fights. And that approach has delivered results. At 2.5 gigahertz, we updated the rules for EBS spectrum that laid fallow for far too long. In that same band, we secured nationwide build-out commitments. At 3.5 gigahertz, we ensured that our rules would work in the real world and completed a successful spectrum auction in that band earlier this year. At 3.7 to 4.2 gigahertz, the C-band, we secured about 300 megahertz of mid-band spectrum to enable providers to offer truly mobile 5G. At 6 gigahertz, we opened up an immense 1,200 megahertz of spectrum. Down at 1.6 gigahertz, we took a long overdue action to help free up that band. And at 2 gigahertz AWS-4, we obtained a commitment to put that spectrum to use for high band spectrum, where it was pretty clear it wasn't going to be put to use before. Now, all of that brings us to the spectrum band before us today, 5.9 gigahertz. Our decision here marks another significant mid-band win. As with all the other bands, there have been thorny issues to contend with, disagreements to work through, and there's been a fair amount of kicking the can down the road in the past. That ends today. Our action will deliver 45 megahertz of spectrum, helping to create a contiguous block of 160 megahertz when combined with the band below, all of which can be put to use immediately for the benefit of all Americans. Opening this spectrum up won't just mean faster Wi-Fi for consumers. It'll help power all of the advanced applications that 5G promises. That might include wearable devices to improve your health, as we've seen during this pandemic, devices for virtual and even augmented reality to make everyday life a little bit easier, or even machine-to-machine connectivity to make America even more competitive on the world stage. I want to thank the chairman and his team for prioritizing the FCC's work on mid-band over the past few years. I'd also like to thank the Office of Engineering and Technology and the Wireless Bureau for their work here and in many other tough proceedings. I'm glad to cast another vote for more mid-band spectrum. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
You know, it was a little over 2 decades ago that the Federal Communications Commission set aside spectrum in the 5.9 gigahertz band for dedicated short-range communications, or DSRC. And at the turn of the millennium, this was the safety technology that was going to make it possible for cars to talk to one another in real time and help reduce accidents. But in the intervening years, it has not quite worked out that way. You see, there are only a few thousand vehicles that have this technology on board out of the roughly 274 million cars and trucks on our roadways. In short, we are not yet close to having the bulk of our vehicles DSRC enabled, which is what is needed for it to be effective nationwide. So you look at this, and it's fair to ask, is there another way? In fact, that's what my colleague, Commissioner O'Reilly, and I have repeatedly suggested. And over the last several years, we have written about this band, we have spoken about this band, and we even traveled to test cars using this technology. I am grateful he was willing to be my partner in this endeavor. He deserves real kudos for his commitment to this subject, and the fact we're even here today is due in large part to his persistence and his belief that we need to find a way forward that updates true safety operations and also makes it possible to expand the use of unlicensed services in the 5.9 gigahertz band. And by and large, this decision does just that. By freeing up 45 megahertz of spectrum in the lower portion of this band, it will supersize Wi-Fi, a technology so many of us are relying on like never before during this pandemic. It will also update our policies with respect to intelligent transportation services by, for the first time, authorizing newer CV2X technologies in the 30 megahertz portion at the top of this band. That does not mean, however, all is ideal, because it's regrettable that the record in this proceeding still features less than unanimous support from our federal partners. Across the board, we need a whole of government approach to spectrum policy and a whole lot less of the public back and forth that leaves this order on the same disputed ground where you see so many of our other recent wireless decisions. We should have taken some more time to clear this up, just as we've been asked to do by the ranking member of the Senate Commerce Committee. And for this reason, I will concur.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Even before COVID, people were relying more than ever on their broadband connections. Today, we're working from our home. Our kids are learning virtually, and many of us will spend Thanksgiving on a video chat with family at some point. All these applications rely on increasingly congested Wi-Fi spectrum, which has become a victim of its own success. And so today's action represents an important step towards reducing that congestion and ensuring that we realize the full potential of our broadband connections. We all rely on Wi-Fi, but it is especially important for the unserved and underserved who may rely on public Wi-Fi to stay connected for essential tasks. And while we shouldn't give up the fight to ensure that everyone has access to affordable broadband, this decision will help those folks as well. I am disappointed by the continued disagreements between federal agencies on spectrum issues. It is exasperating that once again, different agencies in the same administration can't get on the same page. Ranking Member Cantwell noted these disagreements in her letter to the chairman yesterday, calling for the item to be pulled from the agenda as controversial in light of the presidential transition. 4 years ago, in response to similar letters from Congress, Chairman Wheeler pulled all of the items from the November open meeting agenda. In light of that precedent, Ranking Member Cantwell's request, I would have deferred consideration of this item to the new administration and new Congress. Because this item does remain on the agenda today, I do concur as well.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. The saga of the 5.9 gigahertz band brings to the mind of this chairman of the board the 1970s song by chairman of the board, "Give Me Just a Little More Time." In that hit, chairman of the board famously pleaded that if given just a little bit longer, great things would surely happen. As they sang in the song, "Our love will surely grow." Well, something similar has been true of those who oppose reform of the 5.9 gigahertz band. More than 20 years ago, as we have heard, the FCC allocated the 75 megahertz of spectrum from 5850 to 5925 megahertz for Intelligent Transportation System, or ITS services, and designated Dedicated Short-Range Communications, or DSRC, as the technological standard for use in this band. Unfortunately, over 2 decades later, the FCC, the automobile industry, and most importantly, the American people have little to show for that decision. DSRC-based services have evolved slowly and have not been used in a meaningful way to improve automotive safety. For example, according to the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, only 57 operational DSRC projects have been deployed, including 6,182 DSRC roadside units and 15,506 vehicles equipped with DSRC onboard units. By comparison, there are approximately 274 million registered vehicles in the United States operating across approximately 4.2 million miles of roadways. Just think about it. More than 20 years after the FCC allocated the 5.9 gigahertz band for DSRC, 99.9943% of the 274 million registered vehicles on the road in the US today still don't have DSRC onboard units. Now, for years, whenever it has been pointed out that most 5.9 gigahertz band spectrum in the United States is laying fallow, DSRC proponents have claimed that widespread deployment of DSRC-based technology was just around the bend. I heard it when I first called for the FCC to start a proceeding on the 5 gigahertz band in 2012. I heard it when Congresswoman Anna Eshoo and I wrote a joint op-ed calling on the Obama FCC to take action on this band in 2016. And we hear it again today. We just need to give it a little more time. Well, we have given DSRC a little more time. Many, many times. No more. Perhaps the most damning indictment of the status quo is offered by DSRC advocates themselves. Take this assessment from a former US Department of Transportation official, now the director of a prominent university's Transportation Institute, and I quote, "I'll grant you that DSRC is the modern day equivalent of Morse code, but guess what? Morse code still works." Today, at long last, we say in a bipartisan voice, time's up. There are 2 fundamental reasons why we can no longer tolerate this inefficient use of the 5.9 gigahertz band. First, there's a pressing need for us to allocate additional spectrum for unlicensed operations. The pandemic has underscored that consumers need access and more bandwidth to be able to engage in telework, remote learning, telehealth, and other broadband-related services. And we have proof, not concept, but actual evidence that 5.9 gigahertz spectrum can help quickly address this need. Over the last several months, we have granted temporary access to this very 45 megahertz of spectrum to wireless internet service providers, or WISPs, who have immediately put it to use, establishing or enhancing connectivity to rural and underserved areas. Moreover, unlicensed technologies like Wi-Fi provide wireless connectivity for countless products that consumers rely on every day, and the number of such products is expanding rapidly. And the next generation of Wi-Fi service, Wi-Fi 6, is expected to allow for maximum speeds that are 2.5 times faster than its predecessor technology, while providing superior performance in crowded environments as well as improved battery life. Bottom line, more unlicensed spectrum directly benefits consumers in many ways. Second impetus, the automotive industry itself has pivoted from DSRC to cellular vehicle to everything, or CV2X technology. CV2X is more reliable and resilient than DSRC, and it can take advantage of cellular-based connectivity to offload non-safety of life communications. CV2X has momentum both domestically and internationally with automakers such as Ford, Audi, Daimler, BMW, and Jaguar Land Rover pursuing deployment of CV2X equipment. Now, these two factors lead to our decision today. In this order, we repurpose the lower 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band for unlicensed operations. Specifically, we will immediately allow indoor unlicensed use of the 5850 to 5895 band while seeking comment on rules for outdoor unlicensed operations as part of our further notice of proposed rulemaking. We'll require the limited DSRC operations currently deployed over the full 5.9 gigahertz band to transition to the upper 30 megahertz segment of the band within a year. We also adopt CV2X as the new technological standard for ITS operations in the upper 30 megahertz of the band, CV2X being incompatible in most cases with DSRC, and seek comment on the appropriate rules and timeline for transitioning from DSRC to CV2X-based operations. Our action will help to meet the demand for unlicensed spectrum that exists now and is only expected to rise in coming years. And this 45 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band punches above its weight. When paired with other adjacent unlicensed spectrum, we will make available in the near term and on a widespread basis a 160 megahertz wide channel for high throughput unlicensed communications. Our decision today will also improve automotive safety. By moving from DSRC to CV2X, we are shifting from a failed technology of the past to a promising technology of the future. Based on the record, I'm confident that the upper 30 megahertz of the 5.9 gigahertz band will provide the spectrum needed for safety-related services. Indeed, right now, only 20 megahertz of the band are actually dedicated for safety applications. Moreover, it is important to remember that spectrum other than the 5.9 gigahertz band can be used and is in fact used for automotive safety technology. For example, under my leadership in 2017, the FCC made available a contiguous 5 gigahertz wide band of spectrum in the 76 to 81 gigahertz band for vehicular radar systems. And other services, such as traffic light signal preemption, are readily available in other bands, such as the 900 megahertz band and the 2.4 gigahertz band. So, notwithstanding the irresponsible rhetoric of some, this FCC does care about automotive safety. Indeed, it is precisely because we do that we are shifting from DSRC to CV2X. The sad fact is that DSRC has done virtually nothing to improve automotive safety. A few corporate interests cannot squat on this spectrum for a generation and expect to maintain a stranglehold on it by simply giving it the empty slogan of the safety spectrum. Nearly 2 decades of failure is more than enough. The American people deserve better, and I'm optimistic that CV2X will actually deliver what DSRC advocates only promised for years: widely adopted, widely deployed automotive safety technology that will save lives on the road. Given the balanced approach we are taking today, I am pleased with the support we have garnered across the political spectrum, from the Open Technology Institute and Public Knowledge to Citizens Against Government Waste, Freedom Works, and the National Taxpayers Union. I also appreciate the backing that we have received from unlicensed proponents, including the Wi-Fi Alliance, WISPA, and NCTA. I'm also grateful for the recognition from forward-looking automotive interests that our decision today provides a path for CV2X deployment. I also want to salute those members of Congress who've supported our decision to move forward today, including just yesterday, Congressman G.K. Butterfield and Congressman Jerry McNerney. They recognize, as many do on Capitol Hill from both sides of the aisle in both chambers of the Congress, that action from the FCC is needed. Some may highlight the fact that other agencies or other entities have complained about our decision and asked for more time. But this FCC, unlike its predecessor, is not going to kick the can down the road any longer. These performative displays of requests for delay are just that, performative. This FCC is about action. I want to thank the staff for their hard work in drafting this item. From the Office of Engineering and Technology, Baman Badipur, Reza Biasaran, Brian Butler, Jamie Coleman, David Duarte, Patrick Forster, Manisha Ghosh, Howard Griboff, Michael Ha, Syed Hassan, Steve Jones, Ira Keltz, Paul Murray, Siobhan Philemon, Jameson Prime, Ron Rapazi, Rodney Small, Vismantha Thanakun, and Ioli Wilkinsell. From the Enforcement Bureau, Matthew Gibson, Janet Moran, and Axel Rodriguez. From the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau, Renee Rowland, Tracy Simmons, and Michael Wilhelm. From the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, Catherine Nevitt, Roger Noel, Dana Schaefer, Joshua Smith, Don Stockdale, and Joel Tabenblatt. From the Office of Economics and Analytics, Patrick DeGrava, Cher Lee, Catherine Matraves, Patrick Sun, and Alex Yadkinovich. And from the Office of General Counsel, Deborah Broderson, Mike Carlson, David Horowitz, and Bill Richardson. It took a heroic amount of effort over a long period of time for us to get this item across the finish line, and it is due to the dedicated efforts of our career public servants that we're able to do so. Thank you all for your hard work. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Concur.
Commissioner Starks?
Concur.
The chair votes to approve. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Thanks again to OET for the presentations. Madam Secretary, could you please take us to item number 2 on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the next item will be presented by the International Bureau and is entitled Further Streamlining of Satellite Regulation. Thomas Sullivan, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And it is to the distinguished and dapper Mr. Sullivan to whom we turn now.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to present the International Bureau's latest efforts to streamline regulatory requirements, the Part 25 Streamlining Report and Order. Today, we recommend that the Commission adopt changes to Part 25 of the Commission's rules, which govern licensing and operation of satellite space stations and Earth stations. The draft report and order before you would change the current rules to make the approval process for satellite licenses more efficient and less burdensome, while still enabling the Commission to perform its critical role in assessing the interference potential of proposed operations. The changes would also keep the Commission's rules up to date with evolving satellite technology. I'd like to thank the following individuals from the International Bureau for their work on this item: Jose Albuquerque, Paul Blaise, Clay DeSalle, Jennifer Gilsonen, Carl Kensinger, Ron Marcello, Robert Nelson, Troy Tanner, Marissa Velez, and Cheryl Williams. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the Office of Economics and Analytics, Office of Engineering and Technology, Office of General Counsel, Office of Communications and Business Opportunities, the Enforcement Bureau, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for their review and assistance with the item. Clay DeSalle, Attorney Advisor in the Satellite Policy Branch, will present the item this morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, Commissioners. The satellite services relied upon by Americans, including live TV programming, broadband in rural areas, global imaging, and emergency connectivity, require the seamless operation of satellites and Earth stations in a network. Today, the Commission's Part 25 rules governing satellite services treat these satellites and Earth stations under distinct licensing processes with varying requirements. The report and order before you would harmonize the licensing of several categories of satellites and Earth stations to reduce regulatory burdens, increase operational flexibility, and encourage the greater deployment of services to the public. First, the report and order would create an optional, unified licensing process for satellites and blanket licensed Earth stations in covered satellite systems. By combining under one license these space and ground components, the unified license would eliminate redundancies present in the separate licensing regimes. It would extend to Earth stations streamlining measures that the Commission has previously adopted for satellite licensing. At the same time, the unified license would not affect Earth stations that require individual coordination with terrestrial operators. Second, the report and order would streamline Earth station licensing by allowing eligible applicants to certify they will comply with the terms and conditions of the associated satellite license in lieu of providing redundant Earth station technical information. Third, the report and order would offer satellite system designers greater certainty about the location of their Earth stations by aligning the Earth station build-out period with the build-out period of the associated satellite. At the same time, terrestrial operators in the upper microwave flexible use service would be protected from changes that occur during the longer build-out period by a requirement for the Earth station licensee to re-coordinate within 1 year before the Earth station begins operating. Fourth, the report and order would reduce filing burdens by eliminating unnecessary satellite annual reporting requirements and requirements to provide notice of some minor Earth station modifications. Finally, the report and order would retain the existing out-of-band emission requirements for satellite services, pending any future studies of the impacts of modifying this rule. To harmonize and streamline the Commission's licensing of satellites and Earth stations, the Bureau recommends adoption of this report and order and requests editorial privileges for technical and conforming edits.
Thank you, Mr. DeSalle, for your presentation, as well as your hirsute and bow-tied appearance as well. Very impressive. I will now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
No statement for me. I'll support the item. Thank you.
All righty, Commissioner Carr.
Same here. Thank you so much to the team for all the work on this. I know it had a lot of thorny issues involved in it, so thank you for your work on it. Much appreciated.
Okay, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Moving right along. This has my support. I appreciate that it institutes a unified licensing option for certain satellite services, but also that we leave open the possibility for further guidance and additional targeted rulemaking if necessary down the road. Thank you for the team that works on our Part 25 matters.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, no statement from me as well. Thank you to the hard work by the team as always.
Well, 4 for 5 is not a bad record, but I unfortunately am the one. This past Sunday, a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket blasted into the evening sky, carrying the Crew Dragon spacecraft into the heavens and a 4-member crew to the International Space Station. It was the first operational mission of the spacecraft, and it marked a major milestone in public-private partnerships to help advance American leadership in space. We are in the midst of a new space age, and while today's celestial exploration captures our attention, it certainly did mine this past weekend, the communications-related innovation happening in space is fascinating too. This FCC has made it a point to encourage U.S. leadership in this new space age when it comes to communications. We acted early to authorize spectrum bands for use in large, non-geostationary satellite orbit constellations. These NGSOs, like SpaceX, OneWeb, Kuiper, and others, are poised to provide high-speed internet access virtually anywhere in the United States, helping to close the digital divide and increase competition. We also created a new regulatory framework for small satellites in order to encourage space-based startups to innovate here at home. As I said then, there is no reason why a satellite the size of a shoebox with the life expectancy of a guinea pig should be regulated the same way as a satellite the size of a school bus that will stay in orbit for centuries. Well, our reforms got results. Take these words from the head of Link Global, a small set startup who wrote afterward, and I quote, "While some government leaders create barriers that slow down innovation, other nations adopt leapfrog strategies to help their domestic industries capture world leadership. The leadership of the U.S. Federal Communications Commission recently made a decision that will ensure America stays on the leading edge of the next technological revolution." We've also made major reforms to advance connectivity by means of Earth Stations in Motion, or eSIMs. These reforms facilitate deployment of satellite-based communication services to ships, airplanes, and vehicles. This may allow these services to be delivered to those who are often on the go, like students on long bus rides, or shippers on waterways, or passengers and crew on airplanes, or motorists and truckers who are on the nation's highways and byways. And while we seek to facilitate the deployment of satellite technologies, we also recognize the need to protect against the potential hazards posed by the increasingly populated low Earth orbit environment. And that's why earlier this year, the FCC adopted robust rules to mitigate orbital debris and sought comment on additional ways to ensure that we are being responsible stewards of the extraterrestrial environment. This FCC's priority on promoting space-based innovation continues to this very day. Today, we continue our efforts to streamline our Part 25 rules by harmonizing the licensing process for many classes of satellite space stations and Earth stations. These changes will end the need to make unnecessary or duplicative filings with the Commission and will reduce burdens placed on applicants, which will expedite our processing of applications and get rid of some of the regulatory red tape standing in the way of deployment of satellite-based services. We adopt a voluntary, unified licensing process for most space stations and blanket licensed Earth stations and satellite systems operating above 10 gigahertz. So instead of having separate licenses for space stations and Earth stations, these satellite systems will have the choice of operating pursuant to a single license from the Commission covering both. We also align the build-out requirements for Earth stations with the build-out periods for their associated space stations and reduce some of the filing and paperwork burdens that satellite operators face. Finally, we get rid of the requirement that Earth station licensees notify the Commission of minor things that are unlikely to lead to increased interference with other operators' systems. We don't explore space ourselves. We don't build rockets and we don't build and launch satellites. But make no mistake, the FCC has a key role in space. As my friend and former Chairman Newt Minow aptly put it, communications satellites will be much more important than sending a man into space because they will send ideas into space. Ideas last longer than men. This FCC has met that challenge, and because we have, the United States will continue to lead in the new space age. For their work on this order and for doing all that they have done to promote U.S. leadership in space, I would like to thank the staff of the International Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau, and the Office of General Counsel. This item has my full support. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly.
Aye.
Commissioner Carr.
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Approve.
Commissioner Starks.
Approve.
And the chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Don't go anywhere yet, Tom, because I suspect you're going to have a repeat performance. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the next item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the third item on your agenda will also be presented by the International Bureau and is entitled Facilitating Next Generation Fixed Satellite Services in the 17 Gigahertz Band. And once again, Thomas Sullivan, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and let the record show that the Secretary, an Ohio State fan, has now graciously shared the stage twice with a Michigan fan. All things are possible. The floor is yours, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. The International Bureau's second item before you this morning is a notice of proposed rulemaking that would facilitate the next generation of fixed satellite services in the 17 gigahertz band. In the notice, the Bureau recommends adopting proposals to allocate additional spectrum in the 17.3 to 17.8 gigahertz band, space to Earth or downlink direction, to the fixed satellite service. Permitting such operations would increase intensive and efficient use of the band and provide additional downlink capacity for new high-throughput satellite communications. I would like to thank the dedicated staff from the International Bureau for their work on this item. In particular, Jose Albuquerque, Diane Garfield, Jennifer Gilsonen, Neshe Gundelisberger, Carl Kensinger, Robert Nelson, Sean O'More, Marissa Velez, and Jay Whaley. I'd also like to once again thank my colleagues in the Office of Economics and Analytics, Office of Engineering and Technology, Office of General Counsel, Office of Communications and Business Opportunities, the Enforcement Bureau, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau for their review and assistance with the item. Sean O'More, an attorney advisor in the Satellite Policy Branch, will present the item.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, good morning. This notice of rulemaking would propose and seeks public comment on allocation of the 17.3 to 17.8 gigahertz band to space-to-Earth or downlink operations in the fixed satellite service. Satellite service in the United States and around the world is booming. Technical innovations in satellite size and weight, in launch capacity, and in signal processing capability are increasing dramatically, making space-based services an important part of next-generation communications. High-throughput advanced satellite systems rely upon downlink capacity for delivering satellite-based services. In the United States, broadcasting satellite service feeder uplinks operate in the 17.3 to 17.8 gigahertz band, with two other services. In the 17.3 to 17.7 gigahertz band, the feeder uplink allocation is co-primary with downlink broadcasting satellite services. In the 17.7 to 17.8 gigahertz segment of the band, the feeder uplink allocation is co-primary with terrestrial fixed service. Responding in part to a petition from satellite company SES Americom for an allocation for GSO FSS downlinks, the NPRM would seek comment on sharing the 17.3 to 17.8 gigahertz band between FSS downlinks, FSS feeder uplinks, broadcasting satellite service downlinks, and terrestrial fixed service operations. To prevent harmful interference among services in the 17.3 to 17.8 gigahertz band, the NPRM would propose and seek comment on several technical rules, including satellite longitudinal separation, downlink power limits, and polarization and frequency reuse requirements. It would also propose a power flux density coordination trigger and associated data submission requirements, and a coordination methodology between Earth stations. Additionally, it would propose that FSS receiving Earth stations in 17.7 to 17.8 gigahertz band would not be entitled to interference protection from fixed service operations. Finally, the NPRM would propose to define frequency bands to be included in the extended KA band and to establish uplink off-axis power limits to facilitate more streamlined licensing in these bands. The Bureau believes that these proposals could result in greater spectrum capability and operational flexibility for satellite communications, while at the same time protecting services sharing the band from harmful interference. The International Bureau recommends adoption of this notice of proposed rulemaking and requests editorial privilege for technical and conforming edits.
Thank you, Mr. Moore, for that presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No statement from me. I will support the item.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carriage.
Thank you to the team. It also has my support. Thanks.
All righty, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Likewise, this has my support. Appreciate the efforts on this rulemaking.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks. Oh,
Same for me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to IB for the hard work as well.
Here too, I've got about a 15-minute statement, so just buckle in. But no, I'm just kidding. I will forego a statement as well. But I do want to thank for their hard work on this NPRM, the staff of the International Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Engineering and Technology, the Office of General Counsel, and the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau. I mean, across all of our agencies' work, there's a lot of complexity, but the satellite issues in particular are so tricky. And I'm reminded very much of what I remember Steve Kerr saying after one of the Chicago Bulls championships in the mid-1990s, when someone was asking him, what do you think of Jordan's incredible performance? I think it might have been after the flu game. And he just said, I'm glad he's on my team. And that's exactly how I feel about the staff who work on these satellite issues. It's so complex, but we've got the best and brightest at the commission, and we couldn't do this work without you. So I'm glad you're on my team too. With that, we'll proceed to vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Aye.
Oh, sorry, Commissioner Card.
Approve.
Get penalized for not wearing a tie, man. Sorry. Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, to item number 4 we go today.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the fourth item is entitled Telecommunications Relay Services and Speech-to-Speech Services for Individuals with Hearing and Speech Disabilities, Structure and Practices of the Video Relay Service Program and Misuse of Internet Protocol Relay Service. The item will be presented by the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, and Patrick Weber, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Weber, laissez le bon temps rouler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Today, the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau presents to you a draft Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Video Relay Service, or VRS, and Internet Protocol Relay Service, or IP Relay. This item would propose to modify the Commission's rules on contributions to the Telecommunications Relay Services Fund for the support of VRS and IP Relay, to ensure that funding obligations for these services are shared more equitably among TRS fund contributors. I would like to thank CGB staff for their hard work on this item. I would also like to thank the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of the General Counsel, the Office of the Managing Director, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Enforcement Bureau for their contributions to this item. Michael Scott, an attorney advisor in our Disability Rights Office, will present the item.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. I am pleased to present this draft notice of proposed rulemaking on telecommunication relay services, or TRS. This item would continue the Commission's work on revisiting the interim funding mechanism adopted years ago for Internet-based TRS. When the Commission first authorized use of the Internet to provide TRS, it decided as an interim measure that all of the costs of providing Internet-based TRS should be paid by contributors to the TRS fund, based only on their interstate telecommunication revenues, even though Internet-based TRS is used for both interstate and intrastate calling. Last year, the Commission reassessed that approach with respect to one Internet-based form of TRS, Internet Protocol Captioned Telephone Service, expanding the TRS fund contribution base supporting that service to include fund contributors intrastate as well as interstate end user revenues. This item would similarly propose to revisit the funding mechanism for the two other forms of Internet-based TRS, VRS and IP Relay. With the growth in annual fund expenditures for these services, which currently total some $575 million, continuing to support these services only from interstate revenues imposes an unfair burden on interstate services. Therefore, the item would propose to expand the TRS fund contribution base for VRS and IP Relay to include intrastate as well as interstate end user revenues. Under the rule change proposed in the draft item, TRS fund contributions to support VRS and IP Relay would be calculated based on total interstate and intrastate end user revenues of each telecommunication carrier and voice over Internet Protocol service provider. To make this calculation, a single contribution factor would be applied to a TRS fund contributor's total end user revenues. These proposals would not affect the total contributions needed to support VRS and IP Relay. The Bureau recommends adoption of this item and requests editorial privileges for technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
I'm going to submit my statement for the record. Thanks to all the team.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Card.
Also want to add my thanks and appreciation to the team. No statement here.
All right, Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Thank you to our Disability Rights Office who works on these matters. Making functional equivalency continue to have meaning requires us to make sure we update the system that supports it. So this has my support. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, thank you as well. I also deeply appreciate this hard and important work. No statement from me, but thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. I also will have a statement for the record, but we'll forego one here. Just simply want to reiterate my thanks, as my colleagues have done, to the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Enforcement Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Office of Managing Director for the great work on this item. It will make a big difference to those Americans who have disabilities today and in the time to come. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Card?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
The chair votes to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, to item number 5 we go today.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, the 5th item is entitled Revision of the Commission's Part 76 Review Procedures, Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative, and Revision of the Commission's Program Carriage Rules. The item will be presented by the Media Bureau, and Michelle Carey, Chief of the Bureau, will give the introduction.
All right, Ms. Carey, if you are there, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners.
Morning.
Today, the Media Bureau presents what, if adopted, will be the 26th order the Commission has completed as part of its Media Modernization Initiative. This item amends the Commission's procedural rules governing program carriage disputes between video programming vendors and multi-channel video programming distributors, MVPDs. Joining me is John Cobb of the Media Bureau's Policy Division. John will present the item.
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, we are pleased to present this report and order that revises procedural rules governing program carriage disputes and parallel rules governing program access, open video system, or OVS, and good faith retransmission consent complaints to ensure a clear and expeditious complaint process for potential complainants and defendants. First, the report and order amends the statute of limitations for filing program carriage complaints. As currently written, the third prong of the program carriage statute of limitations deems a complaint to be timely if filed within 1 year of the date the complainant notifies the defendant MVPD of its intention to file a complaint. This provision allows a programmer to bring a program carriage complaint at essentially any time, potentially years after an alleged rule violation, undermining the fundamental purpose of a statute of limitations. The report and order amends the third prong to clarify that it applies only in cases where there is no existing carriage contract or carriage offer, or in cases where a party seeks renewal of an existing contract, and the 1 year statute of limitations will begin to run when the defendant MVPD has denied or failed to acknowledge either a request for carriage or a request to negotiate for carriage. For consistency, the report and order also amends the parallel prongs of the statutes of limitations for program access, OVS, and good faith retransmission consent complaints. Second, the report and order harmonizes the procedures governing the effective date and review of initial decisions by an ALJ in program carriage, program access, and OVS proceedings with the generally applicable procedures in Part 1 of the Commission's rules. The rules currently provide that an ALJ initial decision resolving these disputes becomes effective upon release and remains in effect pending review by the Commission. Under the revised rules, ALJ initial decisions in these contexts will not take effect for at least 50 days following release and will be stayed automatically upon the filing of exceptions with the Commission, which is consistent with the rules generally governing ALJ initial decisions. This step will eliminate confusion as to which rules apply in which contexts. The order also establishes a 180-day aspirational shot clock for circulating to the Commission a proposed ruling on review of an initial ALJ decision. The shot clock will start on the date that a party appeals the initial decision. Finally, the report and order deletes from the Commission's rules the program carriage standstill provision, which was vacated by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit in 2013. The Media Bureau recommends that the Commission adopt the report and order and request editorial privileges to make any necessary technical or conforming edits. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will, in my longer statement, just make a couple points. So I appreciate the Commission's consideration of this item, which I've taken the lead on. I think the balance is within the item on the two elements talked about at the briefing is well done and will not cause any harm to anybody. And I appreciate that we've continued our media modernization efforts throughout this last number of years. Lastly, I would say that as well as we've done on media modernization, there's so much more work to do. We barely scratched the surface given the marketplace and where things are and streaming and everywhere else. And so I look forward to future commissions doing much more substantial work, and I thank the chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Carr.
Thank you so much for the team. This is a real important issue to clarify some issues around the edges. Thank you for this, and thank you, obviously, for just the tremendous amount of work that's been done over the past few years. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
So this decision cleans up some inconsistencies in our framework for carriage disputes, and as a result, it has my support. But you know, while we iron out the wrinkles in these rules today, we're also going to need to monitor these policies going forward. That's because it's vitally important that we make sure they work for everyone, including independent programmers who bring diverse voices to the channel lineup. So thank you to the team that worked on it. Again, it has my support.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, I too will support the item. Thank you for the hard work by the team.
Thank you, Commissioner. I also will have a longer statement that I'll submit for the record, but I'll simply say here that I express gratitude to the Media Bureau, the Office of Economics and Analytics, the Office of Communications Business Opportunities, and the Office of General Counsel for the great work on this item. And more generally, thanks for all of the work that has gone into the Modernization of Media Regulation Initiative. It's been, I can't even know how many items, how many notices, how many orders, but the overall gist of it has been to update our rules to match the realities of today's marketplace. And that is something that I think has taken a lot of work to comb through the pages of the CFR, but you've done that with aplomb and care. And that's part of the reason why I think that we are enabling companies to compete to deliver better value for consumers in this sector as in all sectors. So thank you for the work. With that, we'll proceed to a vote on the item. Commissioner O'Reilly?
Aye.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
And I will vote to approve as well. The item is adopted with editorial privileges granted as requested. Madam Secretary, can you please take us to the last item on today's agenda?
Mr. Chairman and Commissioners, last on your agenda, item 6 is an enforcement action for your consideration. The item will be presented by the Enforcement Bureau. Rosemary Harold, Chief of the Bureau, will introduce the item.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Before I turn it over to Ms. Harold, I will note that because this order is an enforcement-related matter, we are going to switch up the order as we have done in past cases involving the presentation of a forfeiture order at an open meeting. As with all open meeting items, the Bureau circulated this item to every commissioner at least 3 weeks ago. But there is, of course, a longstanding practice of the agency that we do not publicly disclose the target of an enforcement action unless and until the Commission decides to take that action. For this item, this means that the agency formally votes on the item, then here's a brief presentation from the Bureau before proceeding to any statements that commissioners might have. This process ensures that the target will not be publicly disclosed until after the FCC has voted to take action. We will follow that precedent here, and so we will proceed directly to a vote on the item. The class number 200178, Commissioner O'Reilly?
Yes in part and no in part.
Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Approve.
Commissioner Starks? Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Carr. I didn't get, sorry, on my screen, I'm just going
2 times.
Commissioner Carr?
Approve.
Sorry, man. Commissioner Starks?
Approve.
And the chair votes to approve as well. Regardless of order, with the agglomeration of votes, the item is adopted with editorial privilege as granted as I anticipate will be requested. So Ms. Harold, please proceed with introducing in a more coherent form than I have, certainly, the item on today's agenda.
Good morning, and it is still morning. Congratulations to everyone for that. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Thank you for your consideration and your vote on today's item, a forfeiture order addressing violations of the Truth in Caller ID Act. Presenting with me is Brandon Thompson, Attorney Advisor in the Telecommunications Consumers Division of EB. I would also like to thank Lisa Gelb, Deputy Bureau Chief, Christy Thompson, Division Chief, Shana Yates, Deputy Division Chief, Lisa Zana, Assistant Division Chief, and Shannon Lip, the Bureau's legal advisor, for their work on this investigation, and also the Office of General Counsel for its invaluable support. Brandon will now present the item.
Thank you, Rosemary. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. This forfeiture order confirms the findings of an earlier notice of apparent liability and assesses a forfeiture of $9,997,750 against Kenneth Moser, doing business as Marketing Support Systems, for unlawfully altering caller ID information, a practice known as spoofing. On May 30th and 31st, 2018, 1 week before California's state primary election, Moser made approximately 47,610 spoofed robocalls that contained serious allegations involving a candidate for the California State Assembly. Moser knowingly used a caller ID that he was not authorized to use. Instead, he used a number assigned to a business rival and thereby intentionally hid his own identity from the people he called. Moser intended to harm the recipients of his calls, who could not correctly identify the caller and could not reliably reach Mr. Moser to ask to be removed from future calls. Moreover, Moser was well aware of the harms he was imposing, having himself gone to court numerous times in the past to pursue spoofing complaints against others. Moser also harmed his business rival, subjecting him to angry callbacks from consumers and a cease and desist letter from the candidate named in the robocalls. Moser also engaged in this spoofing to gain something of value. First, he sought to further his client's interests and increase revenue. Second, he intended to gain a valuable shield from identification, law enforcement action, and consumer litigation. For these reasons and the additional detail laid out in the forfeiture order, the Enforcement Bureau appreciates the Commission's adoption of this item and the grant of editorial privileges. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. We'll now turn to comments from the bench, beginning with Commissioner O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to submit my statement for the record.
Okay. Commissioner Card.
Thanks, all new statement from me. Thanks to the team for their work on this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Rosenworcel.
Well, you're tired of them, and me too. The calls that tumble in every day offering a cruise or debt relief or something else you didn't ask for, do not want, and do not need. They are downright exasperating. Robocalls are degrading communications and destroying trust in our networks. And after a brief downturn in the volume of these calls during the early days of the pandemic, scammers are back at it. The numbers are going up. We need to respond in kind with more action, more enforcement, and more penalties like we do here today. In this decision, we impose a forfeiture against a caller who used the spoofed numbers of a competitor to make tens of thousands of calls to spread misinformation about a political campaign. This was really sordid stuff. 1 week before a state primary, this robocall campaign featured allegations about sexual assault by a candidate that ultimately resulted in the accuser pleading guilty to making a false report of a crime. And so the California Secretary of State referred this matter to us for investigation. We did just that, and as a result, this order has my full support. But it is not the only calling campaign that needs investigation. Just 2 weeks ago, there were reports that millions of robocalls were also using spoofed numbers to spread misinformation in advance of the November election. This too needs attention, because if these calls run afoul of the tools we have to protect consumers, like the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, the Truth in Caller ID Act, and the Traced Act, then this agency needs to act.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Starks.
Yes, no statement from me. Obviously, thankful for the hard work by my old team there in EB. So appreciate it, Chief Harold.
Thank you, Commissioner. And same with me. I'll have a written statement for the record, but I just want to salute the team from the Enforcement Bureau, from the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau, the Office of General Counsel, the Office of Economics and Analytics, and the Wireline Competition Bureau for the cross-agency effort that led to today's forfeiture order. A lot of hard work went in over a lot of days to make this happen, so very much appreciate it. Would any of my colleagues like to make any announcements at this time? Commissioner Starks, I see.
Yeah, so as I've mentioned before, I do believe FCC internships provide an important essential opportunities for students who are looking to enter the telecom policy space. And so I'm proud that we continue our program even as these are remote internships now. And so thank you to my fall interns this year, Erica Jones, Irene Lee, Genesis Montserrat, Justin Perkins, and Elizabeth Rice for all of your hard work this semester. I, of course, look forward to staying in touch with you, and the best of luck in your future endeavors and school.
Oh, Commissioner Rosenworcel, I think I see.
Quickly, I just want to say that last year, I testified before the Senate Homeland Security Committee with Chris Krebs, who was the first director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security. He was dismissed from his job last night, but I want to point out, as I learned at that hearing, as we talked about cybersecurity with those in the room, Chris Krebs is a terrific public servant, and I wish him well in what comes next.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Card, do I see you? Okay. Well, I just have a couple of announcements. I would be remiss if I let today pass without recognizing two of the International Bureau's outstanding staff members who will head into the new year with a new title, that of retiree. We'll start with Susan O'Connell. Susan is retiring from the FCC with over 34 years of government service. She's been with the International Bureau in particular since the Bureau was first established in 1994. To anyone who has worked within the agency or even outside of the agency on matters where foreign ownership was an issue, Susan was the point person. She is known far and wide as the Commission's expert, repository of substantive knowledge on foreign ownership issues. And as I understand it, she's even handed out a personal number to anyone who asks so that they could continue to contact her on her days off, or even as she started to work on a part-time schedule. She's gracefully shared her knowledge with many, many others. She's been a valuable mentor to so many attorneys and law students and interns and everybody on these foreign ownership issues, on dominant carrier safeguards, national security and law enforcement issues, and other things as well. So thank you, Susan, for your service to the Commission, and we wish you very well in the exciting days ahead. Next, we have Kiran Dewadi. Kiran is a relative newcomer compared to Susan, at least. He's retiring from the FCC after only 33 years of government service. His loss will echo beyond our virtual walls, and they'll be felt all the way to Geneva, Switzerland, and beyond. And that's because Kiran has been a valued and esteemed partner within U.S. delegations to international conferences, as well as a trusted negotiator with other countries. Kiran was always the one to see a path forward in some of these very complex negotiations, and was able to use his extensive contacts around the world and his reputation for fairness to try to forge a compromise when others thought there might not be one. And so throughout his career, Kiran's really developed notable expertise across a variety of sectors and issues at the ITU in Geneva, as well as a host of other international and regional fora. And as if that weren't enough, he's also just a brilliant economist, lending his expertise on FCC items and contributing to international organizations like the OECD. It's sufficient to say that Kiran will be missed across many, many time zones, not just our own. And personally, I will say, having worked in this job on a number of international issues, these issues are incredibly complex. Many of them require not just substantive knowledge, but also, as I mentioned earlier in my remarks about Kiran, just a sense of what makes the person on the other side of the table tick. And that kind of reputation for empathy, for expertise, understanding, and willingness to come to the table in good faith is so important in these international negotiations. Our IB staff writ large are just fantastic at this, but Kiran obviously is a key member of that team. And so Kiran, we also wish you very well in your well-earned retirement. Godspeed, and the best to you and your family. If my colleagues don't have any further announcements, Madam Secretary, could you please announce the date of the next FCC agenda meeting?
The next agenda meeting of the Federal Communications Commission is Thursday, December 10th, 2020.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. With that, we are adjourned, and happy Thanksgiving in advance, everybody. Be well.